This is a samurai. You would have seen plenty of samurais in video games and movies, and I think they have the coolest armor, but there's one problem. It's not nearly as strong as European armor, and this is because of the pig iron. It's super strong, but unfortunately that means it's super hard to make. So today we're going to be making this guy. He's a samurai and way easier to make. Now, I've actually already started making the armor. I did one episode earlier, you should go watch that. This is where we're up to. I've made just the torso, and today we're planning on finishing it. Well, except for the helmet, doing everything else. But the question is, where do I start? We're going to start with the arms, more precisely the shoulder blades. These ones right here. Now, for the type of shoulder blades, we have two types. We have this one and this one. The first one is just a plank of wood, while the second one is a bunch of planks of wood stuck together. But we're going to make ours more European, flipping the wood upside down so that they overlap at the bottom, like this guy. But before we make the shoulder blades, we need to make slight adjustments to the armor. I had to cut away these corners so then my arms could move more freely. And now it's time to start on the actual shoulder blades. The way I started was I grabbed my sheet of metal, marked out 3 different lines, all at the same width, cut them all out and gave them a file. Had to make sure they weren't too sharp because I didn't want to nick myself when I was wearing it. After cutting them all out, I ended up with 6. I'm not sure how I did that, but I ended up with 6 and I realized they were way too long, so I had to cut them in half. After cutting them in half, it was time to bend them, because they had to bend around my shoulder. I used my water bottle because it was the perfect size to fit around my shoulders. Now I only started off with bending 4, because I didn't want to bend all of them, make a mistake and need to chuck it all out. I wanted them to stay together like this, and I didn't know how to do it, so I started bending the corners to see if they would fit together better. Spoiler alert, they didn't, so I decided to cut holes in 2 of them. After cutting the holes, I tied 2 of them together so I could line them up a bit better to cut the rest of the holes. You see, I had to be very precise with this, so then I didn't make a mistake. I cut those holes and attached it. There we go, first attachment done. Now it's time to attach the third piece, and this is where I made a bit of a mistake. You see, I drilled a few too many holes. I really just wanted to make sure it would stay together, but after drilling it all, I realized way too many holes, but it still worked, it still stayed together. Now for symmetry, I made sure to drill all the exact same holes on the other side. I started bending more metal, copying and pasting the holes, including the ones I made a mistake on, and we were done. Now it was time to figure out how to attach it to the torso. Every time I had to make an adjustment to the torso was terrifying. I didn't show it too many times this video, but I had to drill a few extra holes later on. Okay, this is what it looks like at the moment. It's great. Now time to add the second one. After drilling the holes in that, I gave them white down methylated spirit, sprayed it down with black. After tying them all together, this is what it looks like. I was so happy with the results. After tying it onto the torso, this is what it looks like. It looked perfect, better than I could imagine. Alright, now it's time to move on to the next part. Okay, technically the shoulders aren't done. There's one more thing to do, and that's add those weird rectangular pieces. To do that, we're going to use those offcuts from earlier, cutting them in half, just like the shoulder blades, bending them, not as much as the shoulder blades though, but still enough that they wrap around me a tiny bit. I then got out the pen, marked down where I was going to drill, and you could see how they were going to connect. I made 2 more holes in the shoulder blades, and they were going to lie right there. After drilling out all the pieces, I gave them a wipe down with methylated spirits to rub off any unwanted residue. Gave them a spray down, left them to dry. I did both sides for these pieces just in case, and tied them together. Tying them together took so long, but eventually they were done, and you could see how they were going to connect to the shoulder blades, just like that. Okay, now the shoulder blades are done, and it's time to move on to the arms, the forearms, taking inspiration from Greek and Roman armor, those pieces that wrap around the arms. Now, as you guys watch me build this, I just want to thank you guys for the amount of support I got from my last video. It did way better than I thought, and we cracked 100 subscribers. I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who subscribed and everybody who's tuned in to watch my second video. If this is your first video, please subscribe and enjoy the content. Alright, back to the build. I drew these diagonal lines so then after I cut the metal and it's sitting on my arm, little bits aren't poking out near my wrist. But I had to go back and fix it because I made it a little bit too narrow. I only started off by making one of them just in case it wasn't good, and I didn't waste all the metal. After cutting it out, we ran into a problem. The metal was too hot to touch. It had been sitting in the sun, although it was early in the morning, the Australian heat was unforgiving, so I had to put all the other metal in the shade. Back to cutting it out, we cut out the other side, gave it a file down so it wasn't too sharp, and it was time to bend the metal. To bend the metal, I tied it down to the table and just used my hands to push down, and I was very shocked by the results. It worked way better than I thought. After loosening off the grips, I pulled it out and put it over my arm. it sat perfectly. So it was time to make a few more. We want to have about 6 on each side. Since we've already made one, we just have to make 5 more. I cut out each piece one by one, filing them down so they're not too sharp, and then bending them. It was a bit of a long task, but after a day's work I got it done. Before we could call them done, I had to drill the holes in them still. And to do that, we marked off circles on each side, a lot of them in fact, and started drilling. This took a long time because I had to do the exact same holes on each piece, but eventually I had them done. After cutting out all the holes, I'd place it over the top of the other pieces, copying and pasting the holes through so then they're all in the same spot. I drilled each of them down until they were all complete and they were ready for painting. Luckily, off camera, I tried them on before painting them. Good thing I did because I realized they were too long. I marked down a line and had to cut the same bit off each piece so then they could fit a lot better. After doing that, I gave them a file, wiped them down with methylated spirits, which took a very long time. Here's a little sped up version of me doing it. Sprayed them down and left them to dry. Now it was time to tie them all together. But tying these ones is going to be a little bit different than how we've tied everything else. Instead of tying crosses, we're just going to loosely tie the rope between each hole so then they can move and wrap around my arm. After finishing that, it was time to move on to the next piece. That concludes our arms, and it's time to move on to these big rectangular pieces on our legs. I'm not quite sure what they're called, but they're pretty easy to make. Just in case you didn't watch my last video or you just forgot, I'm using galvanized steel. Now traditionally, Samurai Armour is actually made out of iron, so my armour is not historically accurate. I mean, I think we already knew that considering my shoulder blades are European and my arm pieces are very Roman. Anyway, back to the leg pieces. I wrapped them around the same thing we used earlier and started drilling the holes. These didn't take too long, only a few hours and we were done. But I realized I was too short, so I quickly cut 2 more. Didn't take too long, just about 20 minutes. After spraying them down and letting them dry, it was time to tie them all together. After finishing them off, I made sure they were super loose, so then when we move our legs, they move just fine. This is where they're going to sit on the armour, just beneath the torso. I tied them on, and this is how it's looking so far. Okay, so there's one more piece that's going to attach to the torso, and that's these smaller rectangular pieces. These ones are a tiny bit different as they're on an angle, unlike the previous ones we made. So we're going to cut them out like this with a little triangle, so then they're on an angle going up towards the torso. Now, watching this armor come together was amazing. I've never really made anything this big before. In fact, this is my first project I've ever done with metal. So if you ever want to get into doing metalwork, just start. Don't think you need to have all these skills. Just try and see what happens. If you fail, you fail. You just got to keep on trying. After sanding them down, it was time to drill the holes. Originally, I drew too many circles on because I realized I don't need 6 on each side, I only need 4. I cut them all out, slowly but surely. Now you guys would have already seen those metal pieces tied onto the armor, so I didn't film this in order. But anyway, this is how they're going to be sitting. I need 3 pieces on each side, and now it was time to wipe them down with metho. Just showing you how strong this thing is. I had those marks on there from the texture earlier, and they wiped off like it was nothing. Here's another little sped up version of me doing it. Now you may be wondering, why am I placing this bit of wood over the top? Well, we had the same issue with the sun, things were just getting way too hot. But anyway, after those were all done, it was time to make the back. We had to make another 3 pieces for the back. We did the same thing by cutting them on an angle, so then they would sit nice and flush, making it look nice and pretty. It didn't take too long till I'd finished them. Now these ones turned out way better than the other ones, so I made even more. I wanted to replace those first ones I made. You see, these ones were a bit longer and they just looked a bit nicer. After drawing down all the holes, we started cutting them out. And that took a long time, but eventually we had them all drilled out. But before we can get on to painting them, there's one thing we had to do, and that was draw each of these little symbols on them. The reason we did this is so I could tell which pairs went together. We gave them a wipe down and then sprayed them down, and it was time to connect them. We lined up each pair together and started connecting them. Just like the previous leg pieces, we didn't want to make it too tight so they could still move. So we're not doing the crisscross pattern, we're just making it go through each hole. After they were done, we tied them onto the armor, and we were done with all the pieces that are going to connect to the torso. And this is how it's looking. It is looking amazing. There's only one thing left to do, and that is the shins. Now, just like the forearms, our shins are going to have pieces that are wrapped around, just like this. Now, these are actually samurai ones, so we're not historically incorrect with these parts. So to start with, just like before, drawing some lines. I drew a bit too many, but I caught myself this time. I realized I only needed to cut out 3 and then cut them in half. So good thing I caught myself, because we'll use that metal for the helmet. Now, just like the forearms, we're going to cut diagonally. Unlike the forearms though, we're not cutting as much off, as we still want most of our legs covered. After cutting them all out and sanding them down, here they were. And it was time to move on to the last bit, and that was drilling the holes. Now we're going to do them a little bit differently. We're going to do 2 lines like this and then have 2 holes on each side, so then we don't waste time cutting heaps of holes that we're not actually going to end up using. Unlike our forearms, which are like these, where each piece has 2 lines of holes cut out. Anyway, after cutting them all out, it was time to bend them. Just like the forearms, we're going to tie them to the bench and then bend them down the middle. We did a pretty good job. I feel like I did a better job on the forearms though. Maybe this is because these are a bit bigger pieces, but nonetheless, we got it done and it was time to move on. We gave them a spray down, left them to dry, and it was time to tie them all together. Now, tying them all together was going to be just like the forearms. Little loops, not crosses. But we came across a problem. We did one of them perfectly, and then I realized I made a massive mistake. You see, I made one piece in the middle correct, but I made one of the edge pieces twice, so it sits a little funny. But that's okay, it will still protect my leg, as you can see on my leg right now. It sits perfectly. Now it's time to try all the armor on together. And here it is, the finished result. I was so happy with how the armor was looking. Now ignore my awkwardness in the armor. I didn't really know how to pose, as I've never actually wore armor before, believe it or not. Anyway, the armor was so mobile. I could move around just fine in it. It was a little bit hard moving my hands towards my face, but it was fine. The armor was super strong and I was super happy with it. Moving around in it wasn't too hard. It didn't feel too heavy when it was on my body, but when it was off my body and I tried to pick it up, it's quite heavy. After fooling around for a little bit longer in the armor, I wanted to try and swing a sword. I went and got my katana. Don't worry, this one isn't actually sharp, and it was time to swing it. But before I got there, my family walked in. Now this is the first time they've actually seen the armor properly, and they thought it was awesome. Anyway, back to the video. I started swinging the sword around and there were a few problems. Although the armor is very protective, it's a little bit constricting. But I mean, normal armor has that anyway, so pros and cons with armor. Now if you guys enjoyed this video, please stay tuned because I'm going to make a third one making the helmet. And please subscribe because I'm trying to hit 500 subscribers by the end of the year and I can't do it without you. Thanks for watching.